The saloon reeked of whiskey and smoke, laughter curling through the air as cards slapped against tables and boots stomped in time to a ragged fiddle. But when the door creaked open and she stepped inside, the noise shifted, turning sharp, predatory, every eye fixing on the stranger with the plain dress and the shawl pulled tight across her shoulders. She paused in the doorway, trembling, clutching the faded fabric as though it could shield her from the stares, and then forced herself forward, her shoes clicking soft against the boards. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the din. "I need work, even scraps. I can scrub floors, wash dishes, anything." A burst of laughter cut her off, cruel and hot. A man at the nearest table leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting, his grin wide. "Work," he jeered. "Ain't no place here for charity cases. Best a girl like you can do is warm a man's lap." His hand shot out, catching the edge of her shawl, tugging her toward him as the crowd erupted in hoots. She gasped, jerking back, her eyes filling with tears. "Don't touch me!" she cried, her voice breaking into the smoke-filled air, desperation and fear tangled in the words. For a heartbeat, the laughter only grew louder. Boots pounding, mugs lifted high. And then the noise fractured, silenced by the heavy thud of boots across the floor. The rancher had risen from his seat near the far wall, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the haze as he strode forward, his hat tipped back, his eyes dark with fire. The man still clutched the shawl, smirking, but his grin faltered when the rancher's shadow fell across them both. Without hesitation, the rancher reached, gripping the drunk's wrist and forcing it down with iron strength, his voice low but carrying through the hush that followed. "Then stand behind me." The words struck like a gunshot, and the saloon froze, every head turning. The laughter dying as fast as it had risen. She stared up at him, her breath caught, tears trembling on her lashes as the warmth of his back blocked the jeers, his body a wall between her and the hungry eyes. Murmurs rippled, disbelief and mockery clashing in the smoky air. "The rancher shielding trash?" someone scoffed. "He's gone soft." But others whispered different, their eyes darting from the torn shawl to the man who held himself tall and unshaken. The drunk jerked his hand free, snarling, but the rancher didn't flinch, didn't break his stance. Instead, he shifted, placing himself squarely before her, his voice steady, his gaze never leaving the crowd. She asked for work. You'll give her respect. Silence followed, tense and sharp, until the fiddler at the corner let his bow fall, strings quiet, the only sound the ragged hiss of her breath. She clutched the shawl tighter, her shame and fear mingled now with something new, an anchor, a shield, a promise in the words that still echoed through the saloon. "Stand behind me." For the first time since stepping into Duston's dust-choked streets, she was not entirely alone. Yet she felt the eyes still burning on her, the ridicule not gone, but waiting, biding its time for the moment when jeers could rise again. And in the shadow of his strength, she wondered if a single man's vow could stand against the weight of a whole town's laughter. The silence in the saloon held only a breath before it cracked apart, laughter spilling back like floodwater through a broken dam. "Respect?" one man barked, his voice thick with whiskey. "She don't look worth a button, let alone respect." Another slapped the bar, grinning wide. "Rancher's gone mad, fighting dogs for a scrap." The words rolled through the room, mocking and sharp, and the men who moments before had sat idle now leaned forward, hungry for the spectacle of defiance. She clutched her shawl tighter, her face burning as their eyes crawled over her, their sneers digging deeper than fingers ever could. But the rancher did not move. His stance broad and steady, his frame still a shield between her and the crowd. He spoke no word, but the weight of his silence pressed harder than their jeers, and slowly their laughter faltered. Only Vernon Hale, a man with a cruel jaw and a thirst for stirring fire, stood from his chair at the back, his voice dripping venom. "Stand behind you, eh?" he drawled, his gaze sliding over her like a blade. "You think a plain girl with nothing but rags deserves the hand of a rancher? You shame yourself, Redfern. You shame this whole town." Murmurs rose, agreement rippling, though some hung back, uncertain. She shrank under the force of his glare. Her shawl clenched so tight the threads bit into her skin. "I only asked for work," she whispered, her voice trembling, but Hale laughed, cruel and sharp. "Work? Duston don't need beggars. We need women who can give more than dishwater and tears." The saloon echoed with cruel laughter again, boots stomping, mugs clattering, and she felt her knees buckle, her strength slipping. But the rancher's hand found her arm, steadying her, firm and warm, and when he spoke, his voice was iron. "She asked for work, not your hands, not your scorn. If that shames you, it speaks louder of you than her." Gasps stirred, some nodding despite themselves. Others scowling deeper. Hale's eyes narrowed, fury sparking at being challenged before so many. "You'll regret standing for her," he spat, his lip curling. "This saloon eats the weak, and she's the weakest I've seen." He reached again, fast as a snake, snatching for the shawl that shielded her chest, but this time the rancher caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting it hard until Hale hissed and staggered back. The crowd roared, some in shock, some in delight at the spectacle of pride clashing against strength. "Touch her again," the rancher said, his voice deep as thunder, "and you'll answer to me." The threat hung sharp in the smoky air, and for a moment no one dared move. Hale yanked free, cradling his wrist, his face dark with humiliation, but he did not strike again. Instead, he sneered, spitting onto the boards. "Let's see how long you can guard a ghost," he snarled, retreating into the crowd. She trembled, her breath ragged, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest, but the rancher did not falter. He guided her gently toward a chair at the edge, his hand firm but careful, as though she might break. The saloon buzzed anew, whispers snapping like whips, mockery, doubt, and something else, something she had never heard before, a trace of respect. She clutched the shawl tighter, knowing the battle had only begun, and that each thread of it was now bound to him as much as to her. The rancher set her gently into a chair near the hearth, where the firelight caught the threads of her shawl, making every fray and tear gleam like scars. She pulled it close, as if hiding in its folds, but the laughter still rang in her ears, the whispers still struck at her heart. Across the room, Hale nursed his wrist with a mug of whiskey, his eyes like coals, never leaving her. The rancher stood near, arms crossed, silent but unmovable, his shadow a wall between her and the venom that filled the room. For the first time since stepping into Duston, she could breathe, but each breath tasted of smoke and fear. She whispered, so low he alone could hear. "That shawl was my mother's. It's all I have left of her. When he grabbed it, I thought I'd lose the last piece of her, too." Her voice cracked, her head bowed, but the rancher crouched beside her, his gaze steady, his words simple. "Then we'll not let it be torn again." She blinked, startled, her fingers tightening on the fabric as though his vow had stitched new strength into the seams. The fire snapped, scattering sparks that drifted upward like stars. But before the silence could settle, a fresh round of laughter broke from the bar. "Look at her," a man jeered, his voice carrying. "Clinging to rags like they're worth gold. Ain't no woman worth less than one hiding behind scraps." The saloon erupted again, cruel voices rising, drowning out the fiddle, feeding off each other's scorn. Her cheeks flamed, her heart crumpled, and she pressed the shawl tighter to her chest, as though their words might pierce her flesh. The rancher rose, his broad frame towering as he stepped into the open floor, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. What she holds is more than cloth. It is memory, it is dignity, and you soil yourselves mocking it. The room stilled, shocked by the weight of his defiance. Though mutters bubbled at the edges, men unwilling to yield their cruelty. Hale barked a bitter laugh, his pride stung, and pushed to his feet. You talk like she's Queen of Duston, Redfern, but all I see is a beggar dressed in pity. That shawl won't keep her from the truth. He stalked closer, the crowd pressing back to clear space, eager for spectacle. Her breath caught, her fingers twisting in the fabric, but she forced herself to rise, trembling though she was, her voice breaking free. It is truth, she whispered, loud enough to carry. Truth that I have nothing else, and still I stand. The words faltered but echoed, silencing more than one sneer. For the first time the crowd looked at her not as shadow, but as something solid, fragile yet unbroken. Hale sneered deeper, fury mounting at her defiance. Stand as you will, he spat, but when that rag is torn from you, you'll see how little you are. His threat lingered heavy in the air, and murmurs rose like thunder. She sank back, her strength spent, but the rancher placed his hand upon her shoulder, steady and firm. It will not be torn, he said, his eyes locked on Hale. Not while I draw breath. And though the laughter rose again, brittle and cruel, the vow hung heavier still, weaving through the smoky rafters until it seemed the very timbers carried its weight. She clutched the shawl, her heart trembling, and knew that every thread of it now carried his promise as well as hers. The night thickened with whiskey and malice, the saloon's lamps casting long shadows across the warped floorboards as the crowd pressed tighter, waiting for the next spark to catch. Hale leaned against the bar, his jaw set, his pride gnawed raw by the rancher's words. The men around him egged him on, their voices sharp with mockery. Redfern's gone soft, one laughed, slamming his mug down, protecting rags and beggars like she's worth something. Another spat onto the floor. I say we strip the shawl and see what she hides. Their jeers sent a ripple of laughter through the room, brittle and eager. And her stomach twisted as if each sound clawed at her skin. She pulled the shawl tighter, wishing she could vanish into its frayed folds. The rancher stood beside her, broad shoulders squared, his silence heavier than any shout. His hand brushed against hers, a quiet anchor, and when she looked up, his gaze was steady, unshaken by the storm around them. Hale pushed off the bar at last, striding forward, his boots thudding hard, each step ringing like a challenge. You think standing between her and us makes her more than she is? He sneered, his voice carrying. Duston don't bow to beggars. And Duston don't bow to Lakota lovers who shame their own kind. Gasps rippled, sharp and ugly, the venom meant to cut deeper than any insult. The rancher's jaw tightened, but his voice when it came was low, iron steady. Respect does not bow, it stands. Hale laughed, cruel and sharp, circling as though the saloon were a ring built for him alone. Respect? He barked. Then let her stand on her own. Strip away the rag she clings to and you'll see what little's left. His hand shot forward, fast and vicious, grasping for the shawl, but she jerked back with a cry, stumbling against the table. Don't touch me! The words rang out, trembling but fierce, and for an instant the saloon froze, the echo cutting through smoke and sneers. The rancher stepped forward, his voice like thunder rolling low across the plains. You heard her? He stood between them once more, chest broad, fists ready, the weight of his frame blotting out Hale's smirk. Hale's lips curled, his pride inflamed. Hide behind him if you will, he spat. But sooner or later he won't be here, and when he's gone, you'll be nothing but rags again. The crowd murmured, some with cruel delight, others with uneasy silence, their faces lit by lamplight, their eyes hungry for a clash. She trembled. Clutching the shawl, her breath shallow, but when she looked at the rancher's back, strong and immovable, a spark of steadiness flickered in her chest. He turned his head just enough for her to hear, his words for her alone. "Hold tight, you're not alone." Then his gaze swung back to Hale, his stance rooted firm, his eyes dark with promise. The air between them thickened, the room holding its breath. Somewhere a mug shattered, the sound like a gunshot, and the saloon erupted in jeers once more, demanding spectacle, demanding shame. Hale spread his arms, mocking. "Let's see if your vow holds when the shawl lies in the dirt." His words hung heavy, and she knew in her bones the moment of tearing was drawing near. The shawl quivered in her hands, fragile as thread, but her heart clung to the vow wrapped tight in its folds, the vow that he would not let it fall without standing beside her. The saloon was a cauldron ready to boil, every laugh sharp as glass, every whisper cutting deep. Hale's pride had swollen past all restraint, and he strode forward with the swagger of a man who believed the crowd would cheer his cruelty. She backed against the table, her shawl clutched so close it seemed stitched into her very skin, her breath ragged as Hale's shadow fell across her. "Let's show Duston what pity hides," he sneered, his hand lashing out. She jerked away, her voice breaking in a cry. "Don't touch me!" But this time he was too quick, his fingers catching the shawl, yanking hard. The fabric ripped with a sound that silenced even the drunkest laughter, a harsh tear that echoed through the smoky air like a gunshot. Gasps broke, the saloon erupting in shock and mockery, men stamping boots, women covering their mouths with feigned pity. The shawl dangled from Hale's fist, frayed threads fluttering like a flag of victory. He held it high, his grin triumphant. "See?" he shouted. "A rag, nothing more. This is what Redfern fights for, a beggar's scrap." She stood frozen, her arms bare, her cheeks flaming, her shame a weight that threatened to crush her. Every eye drank her humiliation, and her vision blurred with tears as the crowd's laughter rose like a storm. For a moment she wished the floorboards would split and swallow her whole. Then a thud cracked through the noise, sharp and sudden. The rancher had slammed his fist onto the bar, the mugs rattling, the laughter faltering. He stepped forward, his stride unhurried, his face carved from stone, and the air bent around him as though even the smoke dared not touch him. Without a word, he closed the distance, his eyes locked on Hale, who faltered for the first time as the rancher's shadow swallowed his grin. "You tear cloth," the rancher said, his voice low but carrying, "because you cannot tear truth." He snatched the shawl from Hale's grip with such force that the man staggered back, his smirk broken, his wrist smarting from the strength behind that hand. The crowd hushed, waiting, and the rancher turned, the shawl hanging ragged in his grasp. He knelt before her, his voice softer now, the heat of it steady against the storm. "It is torn," he said, placing it gently back into her trembling hands. "But so are we all. It still warms, and it still belongs to you." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she clutched the shredded fabric, her shame tempered by the weight of his vow. Gasps rippled, whispers colliding in the smoky air. Some sneered, mocking his tenderness, while others stared in uneasy awe, as if glimpsing strength they had never understood. Hale's face darkened, fury replacing his fleeting triumph. "This ain't over," he snarled, his voice cracking. "You'll bleed for shaming me before them all." He stormed back through the crowd, his men trailing like dogs behind their master, and the saloon roared again, not with laughter but with the buzz of fear, of wonder, of a town torn between cruelty and respect. She clutched the shawl, its threads broken but its warmth intact, and though her body trembled, her heart felt the first flicker of something fierce, dignity rising from the tatters. Yet she knew Hale's threat hung heavy in the rafters, and the next time he struck, it would not be cloth he aimed to tear, but the very life she now dared to reclaim. The saloon slowly bled of noise after Hale stormed out, the fiddle silent, mugs abandoned mid-raise, the smoke thick with unease. She sat at the edge of the hearth again, the torn shawl clutched in her lap, its frayed edges whispering of humiliation she could not shake. Every eye still lingered, some sharp with mockery, others restless with the memory of what had just been torn. Her cheeks burned, her chest rose and fell as though she had run miles, and yet she could not leave, not when her legs refused to move, not when the world outside promised only more jeers. The rancher stood before her, hands braced against the back of a chair, his gaze fixed on the door through which Hale had gone. His jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid, a storm brewing beneath the silence. At last he turned, his voice low but steady, cutting through the thick air. "He will come again." She flinched at the certainty in his words, her fingers twisting in the shawl until the threads dug into her skin. "I can't bear it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Every time they rip it, I feel like I am nothing again." The rancher crouched beside her, his eyes level with hers, and the firelight caught the steel in his gaze. "You are not nothing," he said, each word deliberate, heavy. "They laugh because they fear what they cannot break. The shawl is cloth. You are more." Her tears spilled, falling hot onto the torn fabric. "It was my mother's, the last piece of her I had, and now it's ruined." He reached out, his hand brushing the frayed edge with a gentleness that startled her. "Ruined?" he asked softly. "No. Torn, yes. But torn is not the same as broken. It still carries her warmth, and now it carries mine too." His words wrapped around her like the shawl once had, and for a heartbeat she let herself believe him. But the whispers rose again from the crowd, cruel voices that refused to die. "She'll drag him down with her pity," one man muttered. "Redfern's throwing his name in the mud," another scoffed. The rancher rose to his full height, his shadow falling across them all, his voice ringing through the rafters. "Let them speak. I will not bend." His declaration split the room, some shifting in shame, others sneering deeper, unwilling to yield their spite. She stared up at him, her breath caught in her chest, the torn shawl pressed close, as though his words had stitched strength back into its phrase. For the first time she felt the crowd's noise dim in her heart, drowned out by the weight of his vow. Outside, boots crunched against the snow as Hale's men lingered, their laughter carrying through the cold night air, promises of vengeance woven in every sound. She trembled, fear gnawing at her chest, but the rancher's hand found hers, firm and unyielding. "They will try again," he said, his voice like iron. "And when they do, I'll stand before you, as many times as it takes." She clutched his hand, the shawl pressed between their palms, and though her tears still fell, they no longer tasted of shame, but of something new. Resolve. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air, and for the first time since the tearing, she felt not ruined but remade. Yet she knew the storm was not over. Hale's pride had been split open before the saloon, and men like him did not lick their wounds in silence. When he returned, he would not come for cloth, he would come for blood. The days that followed dragged heavy, each hour weighted with whispers. In Duston's streets, the tale spread like wildfire, how the rancher had stood before the whole saloon, how Hale's pride had been ripped as raw as the shawl he tore. Some laughed, calling it folly. Others murmured that maybe the rancher's strength had shown a kind of truth they'd forgotten. But wherever she walked, eyes followed, mocking or curious, never kind. She kept the torn shawl wrapped around her shoulders, each fray a reminder of shame, yet also of the vow stitched into its tatters by the man who had given it back. The rancher stayed near, quiet and watchful. His hand always close to hers, his gaze scanning every corner as though danger might spill from the shadows. That danger came sooner than either hoped. On the third night, the saloon lamps glowed like embers across the street, laughter spilling into the snow-hushed dark. She lingered by the window of the cabin, clutching the shawl, when the sound of boots struck heavy against the porch. The door rattled under a pounding fist, and a voice snarled through the wood. "Redfern, you think you shamed me? You think Duston will bow to your pity? Come out and face me like a man!" It was Hale, his words thick with rage, his pride dragging half a dozen men with him, their laughter hard and cruel. The rancher set down his cup, his face calm, but his eyes dark, storm gathering. He rose, crossing the room in 3 strides, and opened the door to the cold. There stood Hale, hat low, his eyes burning, his men fanned behind with torches, their jeers a chorus of spite. "Bring her out," Hale spat, pointing toward the woman clutching her shawl in the shadows. "Let the town see what kind of trash you hide. Or are you afraid they'll know she ain't worth your name?" She trembled, pressing the shawl tighter, her heart hammering like a drum. The rancher stepped onto the porch, his frame filling the doorway, his voice steady. "She's not yours to touch, Hale. She never was." Hale's grin curled like a knife. "Not mine, not anyone's. That's the truth of her. Unwanted. You can't change that by playing her guard dog." The rancher's jaw tightened, but he did not flinch. "She is wanted. She is chosen. And you'll choke on the truth before I let you lay hands on her again." The men behind Hale roared with laughter, one spitting into the snow. "Big words," one mocked. "Let's see if he bleeds as proud as he speaks." The rancher stepped forward, his boots crunching the frost, his voice low enough to cut the jeers. "Try." The word hung in the night like a drawn pistol. Hale's grin faltered, but his pride shoved him onward. He lunged, his fist swinging wild, but the rancher caught him hard, shoving him back into the snow. Gasps broke from the crowd, their laughter torn into shards. She stood frozen in the doorway, the shawl clutched to her chest, her breath ragged. The firelight from the cabin spilled across the snow, catching the torn fabric and the rage in Hale's eyes. He scrambled up, spitting blood, his voice a snarl. "This ends in the square, before all of Duston. I'll tear your vow apart where everyone can see." He turned, his men dragging him away, their torches bobbing into the night. The rancher watched them vanish, his chest rising steady, but when he turned back to her, his eyes carried the truth. The storm was coming. And this time, the whole town would be the witness. By dawn, Dustin buzzed with word of Hale's challenge, the gossip spilling from every doorway and hitching post like smoke from a wildfire. The saloon talk had spread to the mercantile, the blacksmith's forge, even the churchyard. Redfern had defied Vernon Hale, and now the square would decide who held truth. She heard it all from the shadows of the cabin, the torn shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, each whisper a knife. "He's ruined," one woman hissed as she passed. "No man stands against Hale and lives." Another voice muttered, "He's a fool to throw his name away on her." The words stung. But the rancher moved about his chores as steady as ever, his silence like stone. Only when the sky blushed with dusk did he step inside, wiping frost from his beard, his eyes finding hers where she sat by the fire. "It will be tonight," he said simply. Her breath caught, her fingers tightening on the shawl. What will he do? He crouched, his gaze level, his hand resting over hers. What he always does, try to break what he can't understand. His voice softened. But you will not break. She shook her head, tears brimming. I already have. They all saw. His thumb brushed the frayed threads of the shawl. They saw cloth torn. They did not see you fall. Tonight they will. The words sank deep, steadying her breath, even as fear coiled tight in her chest. When the square filled, lanterns swung from every post, their glow casting long shadows over the crowd that swarmed like a tide. Families pressed close, children lifted onto shoulders, men leaned against wagons, their voices thick with anticipation. Hale stood near the fountain, his broad frame cutting a dark figure, his grin wide as he cracked his knuckles, pride swelling in his chest. The rancher entered from the far side, his stride even, his hat tipped low, his gaze steady. Murmurs swept the crowd, some jeering, others whispering doubt, a few quiet, curious. She followed behind, her shawl tight across her arms, each step shaking but sure, her heart pounding against her ribs as though it would burst. The crowd gasped, their voices sharp. She dares come? One man spat. Shame don't burn her enough? Hale's grin widened, his voice booming over the lantern-lit square. There she is, the beggar queen herself, clinging to rags and pity. Duston, shall we watch her crumble? Laughter thundered, boots stomping, mugs lifted high. She faltered, trembling under the weight of so many eyes, but the rancher's hand found hers. Firm and unshaken. He stepped forward, his voice ringing loud. You call her unwanted. I call her chosen, and tonight I will prove that truth stands taller than your lies. The crowd hushed, the jeers thinning, the night thick with tension. Hale sneered, stepping close, his eyes like fire. Then let her stand on her own, he spat, reaching for the shawl again. She gasped, clutching it tighter, her knees weak, but the rancher moved, his frame a wall before her, his voice thunderous. She has stood long enough. Tonight, she stands behind me. The square held its breath, the lanterns flickering, the crowd poised between cruelty and awe. And in the silence that followed, the storm of pride and fury threatened to break upon them all. The square erupted the moment Hale lunged, his fist swinging wide, his voice a snarl of rage. The crowd surged back, forming a ring, hungry for spectacle. The rancher met him head-on, their bodies colliding with a thud that rattled the boards beneath the fountain. Hale struck again and again, each blow fueled by wounded pride, but the rancher absorbed them with the steadiness of stone, his fists answering in turn. Gasps tore from the onlookers as the fight spilled across the dirt, lantern light casting long, wild shadows. She stood at the edge of the ring, clutching the shawl, her heart hammering, every strike echoing in her chest. "Break him!" a voice screamed from the crowd. "Make her pay!" another shouted. The noise swelled until it shook the windows of the mercantile and sent the church bell quivering in its tower. Hale's men jeered, their laughter sharp as knives, but others watched in silence, awe creeping into their eyes as the rancher refused to falter. Blow after blow rained down, his strength drawn not from anger, but from vow. At last Hale staggered, blood streaking his lip, his breath ragged, yet his pride drove him forward. With a roar he lunged, not at the rancher but at her, his hand outstretched to rip the shawl from her shoulders once more. The crowd gasped, the lantern swaying with the sudden shift, but before Hale's fingers could brush the fabric, the rancher struck, driving him hard into the dirt. Hale sprawled flat, his hat flying, his pride bleeding into the soil of the square. Silence crashed down, heavy and complete. The rancher stood over him, chest heaving, his voice thunderous in the hush. You tear cloth, but you cannot tear truth. You call her unwanted, I call her mine." His words rang against the clapboard walls, echoing down every alley until the square itself seemed to hold its breath. Slowly, he turned, his hand reaching for hers. Trembling, she stepped forward. Placing her fingers in his, the shawl still clutched to her chest. He took it gently, lifting it high before the crowd, its tatters glowing like fire in the lantern light. "This shawl is torn," he said, his voice steady. "But it still warms. It still belongs, just as she does." Murmurs rippled, uncertain, divided. Some scoffed, unwilling to yield their scorn, but others shifted, shame flickering in their eyes, as though the truth in his words had cut through the smoke of cruelty. Children stared, wide-eyed, their small hands clutching at skirts and coats. A woman near the front wiped at her eyes, though she said nothing. Hale groaned in the dirt, his fury smoldering but broken, his men too cowed to step forward. The rancher lowered the shawl, draping it back across her shoulders with a tenderness that stilled her trembling. She lifted her chin, meeting the eyes of the crowd, no longer cowering beneath their jeers. For the first time, she stood not in the shadow of shame, but in the light of defiance and vow. The silence deepened, broken only by the hiss of lanterns and the ragged breath of a man whose pride had been torn to rags. Yet in that silence, she knew it was not the end. Hale's hatred still smoldered, and before the night was over, he would rise again. This time it would not be her shawl he sought to shred, but the very bond that had bound them together before all of Duston. The crowd held its breath as Hale dragged himself up from the dirt, his face twisted with rage, his pride bleeding heavier than the cut on his lip. Lanterns flickered, the square glowing like a stage, every eye fixed on the man who refused to yield. His voice cracked, raw with fury. "This ain't finished. I'll tear that rag from her yet, and show Duston she's nothing." He lunged once more, wild and reckless, but the rancher met him with a single crushing blow. The sound cracked through the square like a rifle shot, and Hale collapsed in the dust, unmoving save for the shallow rise of his chest. Silence followed, thick and absolute, broken only by the soft hiss of the lantern flames. The rancher stood over him, his chest rising steady, his shadow long across the ground. Then he turned, his gaze falling on her where she stood trembling at the edge of the ring, the shawl clutched to her chest. Slowly, deliberately, he crossed to her, every eye in Duston following. He took the torn fabric from her hands, holding it high so all could see, the tatters glowing gold in the lamplight. "This shawl has been mocked," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "Torn and trampled, but it has endured, just as she has endured. And before you all, I say what's torn can still be whole, what's scorned can still be chosen." Gasps and murmurs rippled, the weight of his words breaking through the sneers. Some men dropped their eyes, shame darkening their faces. A few women dabbed at tears, their mouths trembling with words they did not speak. For the first time, the square did not laugh. It listened. He lowered the shawl, placing it gently across her shoulders, his hands steady, reverent, as if crowning her in front of them all. Her breath caught, her tears spilling not with shame, but with a dignity she had thought lost forever. The crowd hushed, the jeers smothered by the sight of her standing tall, her chin lifted, her shawl gleaming like a banner. The rancher's voice softened, but it carried still. "You called her unwanted. I call her mine, and if any man doubts it, let him stand where Hale has fallen." No one moved. Hale groaned in the dirt, his pride shattered beyond repair, his men shifting uneasily, unwilling to lift him. The silence deepened, and in it a truth settled over the square heavier than stone. The jeers had lost their power. She raised her hand, trembling, and touched the shawl where it lay upon her shoulders, feeling the weight not of shame but of choice, of vow, of something sacred. For the first time she did not shrink beneath their eyes. She met them, steady and unbroken. The rancher turned, his hand finding hers, his grip firm, his gaze locking with hers for a moment that seemed to still the night. Together they walked from the square, the crowd parting in silence, the lanterns flickering as though bowing to their passage. Behind them Hale lay crumpled, his reign of scorn undone. Ahead, the night stretched wide, the stars sharp above the dark plains. She pressed the shawl closer, its threads frayed but strong, its warmth carrying both her mother's memory and the vow of the man who had given it back to her. For the first time in Duston, she did not feel like the unwanted one. She felt chosen. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Echoes of the West. If your dignity was torn in front of a crowd, would you cling to the shreds or wear them proudly as your crown?